we are going to have all these slides available for you along with the audio and visual portion on our website for up to 3 years. So after today and you want other folks in your organization to hear this same webinar, send them to our site, and if you're a SIG member, you can download and replay these for 3 years. And also at the end of today's presentation, we will push the slide deck to your desktop. So at the very end, just wait for a blue box to pop up on your screen, and that time you can download those slides to your desktop. The important reason you need to do that is also you'll have the contact information for today's presenters, so it's a way that you can just reach out directly to them. One last thing, if you're having trouble with any of your sound, before you call in or text in and complain to us, go to the upper left-hand corner, and you can typically turn up the volume on your computer, and then also just check your speakers as well. So what I want to do is jump into today's content. And with us today, we have John Evans and Conrad Snover. I've known both gentlemen now for, wow, a long time. I think I've known John for 20 years and Conrad for probably 12. And they're great people, and they certainly are subject matter experts. John is a managing partner with Denali Group. His focus areas are the Denali Consulting and the Denali Intelligence service lines. In 2006, John led the startup of Denali Intelligence, which offers subscription-based, category-focused market intelligence designed specifically for sourcing professionals. John has consulted in supply chain and strategic procurement space since 1989, beginning with A.T. Kearney, and then co-founded Denali Consulting in 1996. He has consulted with more than 100 Fortune 500 companies, and he's led more than 50 strategic sourcing programs across indirect and direct categories. With him today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Conrad Snover. He's also a partner in Denali Group with 11 years of strategic sourcing consulting experience focused on supply chain management. He has deep expertise in launching and managing programs focused on strategy design, category management, strategic sourcing, supplier development, and organizational sustainability. Conrad's consulting experience includes time spent at management consulting firm A.T. Kearney as well before joining Denali, and he's consulted to numerous Fortune 1000 companies in North America in a variety of industries, including oil and gas, utilities, high-tech, banking, and insurance. So, folks, we've brought to you today, or Denali Group brought to you today, two outstanding speakers who really know their topic. So I want to just welcome John and Conrad.
Thanks, Dawn. This is John Evans, and I'm going to be kicking it off today, and then Conrad's going to be covering some of the content as well. So, again, thanks for joining us. Our topic is Stop Sabotaging Your Procurement Transformation Efforts, 5 Mistakes to Avoid. And what we've tried to do today is to really just come up with some lessons learned that we've seen from other procurement transformation efforts, from clients as well as just others in the space, and share those with you and hopefully helping you to make your procurement transformation efforts more effective and to increase your results. So before we get started, let me just give you a brief intro about Denali Group if you're not familiar with our company. We've been around since 1996. We consider ourselves a procurement solutions company. We have 4 major service lines. We have Denali Consulting, which is basically a consulting division helping companies design and implement procurement transformation. We help with strategic sourcing programs, logistics optimization, category strategies, category management programs, basically anything around improving procurement and logistics. We also have Denali Sourcing Services, which is a managed sourcing execution business line. So we basically help companies increase their bandwidth for strategic sourcing execution services. We have Denali Intelligence, which is a subscription-based as well as custom supply market intelligence offering. We help companies, we provide over about 80 different spend category market intelligence reports to help procurement professionals understand what's happening in the market, pricing trends, what's happening in the supply market, things like that. And then we have Denali Recruiting and Staffing, which is a staffing and recruiting arm. We do temp staffing as well as permanent search and recruiting, focused exclusively in the procurement space. That's a little bit about Denali Group. So today we're going to start out talking a little bit about just what is procurement transformation, what does it really mean, what is it, what isn't it. We'll go through the 5 common mistakes that we've seen probably most often that companies make and some things that you can do to avoid those. And then we'll wrap up with some kind of strategies for avoiding failure. And then we've got a couple of polling questions along the way, and we'll take questions from the audience as well. So if you're covering this from a PDF file, we're on page 10, or slide 10 of the overall deck. Procurement transformation defined. So what is procurement transformation? Two key words for us that distinguishes transformation from just standard procurement cost reduction programs is holistic and long-term. Procurement transformation, as we define it, is a holistic approach to improving all aspects of a procurement operation for improved results and long-term sustainability. Again, the key is procurement transformation looks holistically. It's not just about sourcing or just about supplier development or just about getting some savings. It looks at all aspects of a procurement operation. We've got a model that Conrad will cover later that gives you an example of what we mean by that. And the key is it's about long-term sustainability. It's not just let's get some savings in the next 6 months. It's how can we position the procurement organization for long-term excellence. And that means investing in people, looking at your structure, looking at your processes. Again, not just going out and executing some sourcing teams. So if you look at some of the bullets we have, what is it? It's an improvement approach that focuses on all dimensions of procurement effectiveness. It's about setting goals to increase and expand procurement's total value. Again, it's not just about savings. It's about total value, whether it's procurement's ability to increase revenue generation within the company, savings, diversity goals. There's lots of ways that procurement can add value. So it tries to expand the envelope. And then it's, again, a balance of long-term and short-term objectives. What it's not a short-term project-based initiative. Again, transformation isn't just something you go out and you do for 3 months and then you're back to business as usual. It tends to be a fairly large, broad-based initiative. Certainly it's not just about cost reduction, as we talked about before. It's not just about sourcing. It looks at all the different procurement processes. We're going to start out, before we get into the content, of the 5 common mistakes with a polling question. To really just get a gauge on where everyone is with regard to their transformation, if you've been involved in transformation so far. So the question is, how would you rate your organization's procurement transformation efforts to date? Are you a rock star, A, very successful, flawless, no significant issues, great results? Are you B, successful, but some lessons learned and stumbling points along the way? Are you C, mixed results, didn't realize the benefits expected, but got some results? Are you D, disaster, would not recommend? Or are you at E, where you really haven't been involved in procurement transformation, you're really just learning about what it is? So let's take some time out to see what the results are from those.
Okay, so we're going to leave the poll open for just another 20 seconds or so. So folks, just go ahead and click on one and hit submit, and it takes about 10 seconds after we close the poll for us to populate the results. So based on a couple hundred people that are responding, John, what are you guessing? What do you think you're going to see?
I would expect probably B and C. Most people that we've talked to have found the procurement transformation to be successful, but there's certainly been some issues or lessons learned, which is one of the reasons we put this presentation together. So I would guess it would be mostly B or C.
The other reason to add, this is Conrad, the other reason that I would agree with that, John, is that, people use different definitions for procurement transformation. So I think you'd expect to see mixed results and kind of a different understanding along the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're just going to pop up the results in 1 second here. And I'm guessing by the fact that we had so many people register that you were exactly right, John. B and C.
Yep.
Well, that's 90% of the total, so that was a good guess.
Well, that's hopefully there's some people out there that can get some value from our presentation. Hopefully it's not too late. So.
Good.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Conrad, who's actually going to go through some of the 5 most common mistakes that we see in procurement transformation.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Don, for giving us this forum today, and thanks to everybody for joining, and hope we provide some interesting insights along the way. As we have done many countless procurement transformations over the years, one of the kind of the neat things for us, and neat things for me personally as well, is that, as I mentioned just a minute ago, clients have different definitions of procurement transformation. And so I One client just did sort of rewrote procurement policies and procedures and called that transformation. Another company sort of redid their organization structure and called that transformation. And as you'll see, we contend is that procurement transformation should take a holistic approach and incorporate those elements, but also others. And so what's interesting for us over countless procurement transformations that we've helped clients with is that we've been able to see sort of the key factors that need to be considered and incorporated as you go to make sure that you end up in a good spot. And so from our experience, we identified these 5 common mistakes that are best avoided if you want to do a good job with your procurement transformation project. So let's just run through these quickly, and then we've got a page on each. So the first is not having a clear vision. Of course, you want to have a roadmap and an understanding of where you want to end up before you get started. The second is thinking that it's just about sourcing. And, we could probably expand the second and then the third, which is thinking that it's just about savings. I'm sure people on the phone and some of those that had mixed success, the poll results demonstrated mixed success with procurement transformation. Maybe there was somebody out there that thought it was just about the process, or thought it was just about the org, or thought it was just about one piece or another piece. And the point here is that it really is a holistic project. All the puzzle pieces need to fit together properly to make this thing successful. However, that leads me to the fourth item, trying to transform everything. Of course, you want to avoid sort of a giant big bang approach and overloading resources and becoming distracted and maybe not focusing on the biggest issues first, et cetera. So you definitely want to have a logical, deliberate approach to the transformation. And then lastly, along the way, we want to make sure that we don't forget about the softer side of things, and incorporate the people element and some of the other softer elements of procurement transformation. So we'll go ahead and jump right in, and we'll cover each of these separately. So we'll start with not making sure that we have a clear vision on the next page. So there we go. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that you do not embark without a clear vision. Okay, so like I mentioned a minute ago, want to make sure you have a roadmap. Want to make sure you have some hypotheses. Want to make sure you understand the best practices. Make sure you understand benchmarks. What are other people doing? What sort of end state are you looking for? So this is, some of this stuff is general project management, right? It's how do you want to structure the work in such a way that you're sure that when you end up and you've completed the work, that you've arrived where you planned on arriving. So you can measure your success and understand what progress has been made, and understand if you've actually done a transformation or possibly just made some minor modifications along the way. So the way to do that is not necessarily through slick vision statements and making things more fancy than they need to be, but just understanding what the desired outcome will look like. What do you want that end state to look like? Is it just a process improvement? Is it savings? Or is it really a holistic project that we can call transformation? The other element that I think very successful transformations are sure to incorporate is this linkage between corporate goals and having them trickle down all the way through department goals, then sub-department, like maybe a portfolio or category, or indirect spend or direct spend, different subgroups within procurement, sourcing, et cetera. Make sure those organizations' goals are tied to the corporate goals. And then all the way down to the individual goals, make sure the individual's goals are tied to the corporate goals. And then also your supplier goals. So if there's, for example, the easiest one, of course, is there might be a EBITDA improvement goal at the corporate level, and sourcing says, well, we can contribute that with some savings initiatives, and that trickles all the way down to a specific buyer or category manager or sourcing manager's responsibilities as they manage their group of suppliers, and their suppliers have savings targets that roll all the way back up through the organization to that same EBITDA goal. So we want to make sure that we start with a clear vision. On the next page, For those following along, we're now on page 14. The typical procurement transformation objectives and deliverables typically fall into these two buckets. We have bottom line financial results, we have sustainable procurement excellence. So bottom line financial results, this is savings. We talk about savings. We all know what savings are. So hard dollar savings, strong focus on external cost reduction, not so much on the softer side of savings with cost avoidance, with some of the avoided costs and some things that aren't quite as interesting to the organization. But how do we generate hard cost savings? So we've got immediate savings from in-flight negotiations. Let's get somebody assigned immediately to sort of be a hitman. And that hitman or woman runs around and finds deals that are ripe for quick negotiations and cost relief to the organization, so that on day one we can immediately show that we're hitting savings. Now, in parallel, we'll start some sort of shorter sourcing initiatives that will yield sustainable sourcing savings in the medium term, and then we do some long-term, sort of more traditional sourcing categories for the larger, more strategic, more complicated sourcing categories. So by staggering the sourcing efforts, we can make sure that we build momentum quickly and generate support from the executive board and build that momentum that we can carry through some of these other sourcing initiatives and savings realizations. Now, the key part about this is the metrics. So if we can report on cost, quality, and service metrics that are coming out of these efforts, that will, again, build support and generate support by demonstrating that the process is comprehensive and sustainable, and it's not the sort of flash in the pan kind of thing. But that's not procurement transformation, and so, we'll get into this in more detail, of course, but that alone is not procurement transformation. The other piece that has to be considered is sustainable procurement excellence. And so the key is to do these things in parallel and make sure that these two initiatives really operate and together bring value to the organization. So what we mean by this is a new operational blueprint that incorporates different elements, but that comprehensively makes the procurement environment and the sourcing environment better. So we want to transform all of those elements and improve, whether it's process, supplier management, any number of those areas. We want to basically take a comprehensive view and improve in a transformational way the manner in which the procurement organization serves the rest of the business. And I think that's the other point that is sometimes lost, is that procurement's fundamental goal and reason for existence is to serve the business and to provide value to the organization. And so everything that procurement does should ultimately be aimed at improving the value to the organization.
Go ahead. Before you move ahead, I have a couple questions that have come in that I'd like to address before we get off this slide. The first one is the goal of transformation ever to get more innovation from suppliers? And if so, what best practices would you recommend?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, sometimes that is indeed a goal of transformation. Whether it's innovation from suppliers or helping innovation, sort of let me take a step back real quick. Innovation is sort of a hot topic these days, and as companies continue to try to innovate, this is at the high level of companies, sort of strategic level, not just within procurement. But as companies try to innovate and continue to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, they are beginning or continuing to look at procurement for help. And so one of those areas is obviously in the supply base. So procurement being the manager of all the supplier relationships. Procurement is oftentimes the first interface for working with suppliers and helping suppliers deliver their innovative ideas through to the organization. That's really kind of the biggest part. But then some organizations we're actually finding are leaning on procurement to help drive innovation through other areas, maybe identifying potential supplier acquisition targets is one, helping procurement with cash flow issues by, I didn't say that right, asking procurement to help the organization manage cash flow through creative, dynamic bidding, for example, of payment terms with suppliers. So procurement is definitely becoming more actively involved in that area. And if you think about, to answer the question now, Dawn, if you think about the way procurement used to be, where more contracting, administration, clerical support, that organization isn't really tuned in and able to help out in kind of these innovative, sort of more creative approaches to managing the supply base. And so, in order to do that, we'll talk about this a little bit with organizational transformation, getting the right people in place, getting the right metrics in place for managing suppliers that will help you track and get visibility to this. So, many companies are seeing that the organization and the enterprise wants procurement to take a bigger role and to add more value to the organization, and this is one way to do it. And I think that's maybe, to sum up the answer to this question, it's procurement often has been asking for a seat at the table, right? We want a CPO seat, we want a seat at the table when we're making executive decisions, we want a seat at the table when we're making strategic buy decisions. The way for procurement to accomplish that objective is to generate value. And in generating value, the organization will see that procurement deserves a place at the table. And so that's really the evolution that we're seeing as well. And that by generating value, procurement is invited to contribute to innovation. And oftentimes, in order to be staffed up and organized to do that, procurement does need to transform the operation and make it more best in class.
Okay, so then also, when you're making your recommendations, do you see them applying equally to BPO and ITO, so business process outsourcing and IT outsourcing initiatives?
Yeah, so define the question, Don. When you say
when you come up with recommendations on practices to make transformation really stick and get bottom line financial results and sustainable excellence, can these apply to outsourcing relationships as well?
Oh, absolutely. So, the most critical perspective of an outsourced solution is that it is a supplier who provides a service. So whether that supplier is an office supplies supplier or your IT BPO supplier, they're still a supplier that's managed. And, of course, they're in different criteria, and, of course, they're managed differently. But at the end of the day, does your organization have the proper tools in place to manage your suppliers? So, for example, do they know that to stratify suppliers and manage them differently, to manage the outsourced vendors differently than they manage office supplies? Is the organization set up properly to have different tiers of management so that everybody understands that different suppliers take different amounts of effort and should maybe participate in different programs at different levels? But yes, a lot of our customers we're seeing are actually sort of more closely integrating the group that manages those outsourced service provider contracts more closely with procurement, so that the two groups can more tightly share best practices and tools and techniques.
Okay, so I like this one. This person maybe knows that you actually have a domicile up in Lake Tahoe, but it says, much like one needs snow to be able to ski, what would you suggest needs to be in place beyond expectations? So you can put expectations in place, but is there an underlying, and maybe you'll get to that with the organizational piece coming up.
I think we will get to that. So maybe we should talk just briefly about it now, and then make sure that we circle back and deal with it more closely when we get through on actually the next page when I'll talk about the framework we use and all the different elements. But what needs to be in place at the beginning with this sort of vision and some of these higher level elements that we talked about is the expectations across the organization need to be aligned in terms of what is going to be accomplished. So, just like we said, you can't start on a journey unless you know where you're going, and otherwise you'll never know when you get there. I mean, that is the fundamental issue around expectations. But the other elements that need to be in place are things like, cross-organizational support and budgetary support if investments are needed in professional services to assist with the process, for example, which is, of course, what Denali does. The understanding and expectation that maybe some non-core services should not be executed internally anymore, and the organization should be open and willing to consider different approaches. And the slide you're looking at now sort of illustrates all those different pieces and parts that we consider when we help organizations through a procurement transformation effort. So you can see, starting in the light blue at the top and working your way down to the darker blue at the bottom, there are these elements that we talk about: category management, sourcing execution, transactional procurement, supplier and category management. So these are all sort of the more traditional elements that we think of in terms of procurement and procurement and strategic sourcing. But as we mentioned, transformation is more than just sourcing, right? So that top level, you could say, well, those are kind of more sourcing related. No, category management is a more sophisticated way to approach your suppliers, but at the end of the day, it's supplier management and strategic sourcing and procurement. But as you work your way down through this structure here, this framework we use, well, staffing, training, and knowledge management. So is there sort of an appetite for developing staff and working with the staff to enhance their abilities and train them and then retain their knowledge in sort of center of excellence and repositories, so that if they leave or if they move on to a different project, or if somebody else does the same or similar work again, how do we retain that knowledge and not feel like we're in Groundhog Day doing things over and over again? On the third row here, technology, process, and performance, things a little bit more sort of infrastructure and support for the transformation. And then on the bottom, program and change management will help guide the transformation. So this is one of the core issues that we're talking about. I personally, and Denali, working with our clients, we have seen clients go after one of these boxes and call it transformation. And, it's fine, right? I mean, organizations and have different appetites, and they have different sort of cultures and different ways to approach things. But I will contend that unless you take a conscientious approach to all of these elements, it's not a true procurement transformation. You might do a process transformation. You might do a sourcing transformation. You might implement category management. You might do an organizational assessment and redesign. But unless you're doing a comprehensive, or at least viewing all of these elements together and deliberately evaluating them and deciding how you want to proceed, unless you're doing that comprehensively, it's not a true procurement transformation. And you'll end up with a project and some incremental improvements and not making a big leap forward, but more small steps. But admittedly, they'll still be in the right direction, hopefully.
So, Conrad, before you move forward, can you go back to slide 14? I have two questions that came in on that one now. And I love this one. This slide 14 suggests that the two objectives are value-weighted equally, when in fact our leadership focuses more on bottom-line financial results. How do you keep them in balance when short-term savings are oftentimes more important than longer-term change? And then another question very similar. It says, our executives say they want transformation, but they really just want savings. How do I deal with that?
I can give a couple of comments or perspectives on that, Conrad, if you'd like.
Please.
We think both of these are very important, and a lot of organizations actually use the short-term savings to fund a longer-term program. So they acknowledge that, we've got to get some savings up front, even very quickly, but we'll use that to fund a longer-term transformation effort. And we find that to be very successful. So it's not like we're spending a lot of money, whether you're using consultants or not, or just time and energy in the organization. You actually consciously have a financial roadmap where you say, we're going to get X savings, within 6 months, and that will fund the entire program. The program may take, 18 months. But so that's one part of it, that if you acknowledge it, that you need it, and that can fund, the longer-term objective of just transforming the whole enterprise. And then the other thing is just what we try to do is really acknowledge and talk about up front that, it's one thing to say you want to get $50 million savings in 6 months or 9 months or whatever your targets are. But if you want procurement to continue adding value on a long-term basis, if you want X million per year every year, and maybe even you want that amount to increase, or you've got some other intangible goals like increasing innovation and reducing lead time or reducing inventories or other things that procurement can help affect, then we just try to communicate to leadership that you've got to invest in some of these longer-term initiatives if you really want to get beyond just the initial short-term savings. And I think in most companies, executives can appreciate that. They're certainly not going to take their eye off the short-term savings target, and you got to make sure that you're not just using take a long-term view as an excuse. You've got to acknowledge both. But I think just making it visible and really helping with the short-term, but keeping their eye on the long-term objective.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, John. And I think the challenge for probably a lot of folks on the phone is that there's a desire for immediate savings and immediate budget relief and immediate return and a short-term view, but the longer-term view is a little bit tougher to commit to. So what we always try to position the Procurement Transformations projects as not a short-term project, and this is not a sourcing project, it's not a savings project, but it's a way to fundamentally change the value, the level of value that the procurement organization can deliver to the rest of the enterprise, and then make that value sustainable. So it's not a 6-month project, it's not even a 1-year project. We're actually fundamentally changing the operation.
So I know you guys are going to talk about the actual quantifiable benefits of a transformation, but is there a type of business case that you could share with people, perhaps offline, about how to put together a business case for procurement transformation? We'll actually talk about tangible, quantifiable benefits.
Absolutely.
Okay, so folks, for those of you asking for those kind of examples, and we do have a lot of questions in queue, why don't we take those offline and see if we can get some examples directly to you, and then I don't know if you guys have a white paper or anything like that on that, we could send it as a follow-up as well.
Yeah, that's perfect, Don. We'll collect that and follow up with those folks.
Okay.
Let's move on to page 16 in the effort to stay on track here, on time here. These questions are fantastic, though. I think this is what really makes the discussion sort of more rich for all of us involved. So
and I tell you, you're going to love these questions if we can get to all of them. They're great.
Okay. So the third risk, or the third mistake to avoid, is focusing on the savings. And we talked about this quite a bit, so I'll breeze through this quickly. But while we don't want to ignore the savings, if you focus just on the savings, then you're doing a sourcing project. You're not doing a procurement transformation. So like John said, focus on the savings, generate the momentum, let the savings fund the other transformation initiatives, if that's the way the structure works, and make sure that at the same time you're building a dashboard to track the value that a transformation will identify. So things in this dashboard that it's kind of this little mini snapshot just to give you a visual, but things that we'll commonly put in a dashboard like this. On the top, definitely we're going to put savings right up front because that is the value, and we're not pretending it's not. So it's things like amount of spend under management, savings reports, compliance reports, which helps identify specific business units or properties or regions that are performing better than others, and help move the enterprise together consistently. But at the same time, we also track things like SLA related, like procurement metrics, right? What's our procurement cycle time for RFPs? What's our procurement cycle time for quick bid projects? What's our procurement cycle time when somebody needs a PO cut? So by generating, sort of holding our own procurement's own feet to the fire and saying, look, this is how we're performing and this is what we're going to change, that will help, Don, with the question that you asked a minute ago, that will help demonstrate that this is a comprehensive project. At the same time, some other things that we track are supplier scorecards. And so we'll say, look, we are now managing our top key suppliers, and here's how they're scoring, and here's how that's improving over time. And then we'll also track, sort of in the same tune of holding our own feet to the fire, we'll track things like category performance, pricing performance against indexes. And so we'll say, when we put the contract in place, our prices were X and the index was Y, and over time that's tracking the following way, and therefore we should bid it, or we shouldn't bid it, or we should keep an eye on it, or we should implement some more creative approaches to supplier management, whatever the case may be. But the point is, you're tracking and reporting on things that generate value to the organization, not just on sourcing savings. And of course, if you can see how these points are all tied together, right? So if you go back to the beginning and you say, well, what's the end state? And you want to kind of start with a roadmap and an end state in mind. Well, it's pretty pretty neat if you can add some metrics to that. Okay, we're currently at this point, and by the end of this project, we want to be at that point, and then a year out, we want to be even further and have our cycle time down to, X days instead of Y, or whatever the case may be.
So as you probably would have guessed, a lot of people would like to get some examples of the procurement dashboard. So we will ask you to follow up about that offline as well afterward. Because it's actually impossible to read on the screen.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's in order to make the file size small, it's blurry. So we can send out either a better example of this or some discussion on what you'd include there, and happy to do that.
Okay, so folks, if you do want to follow up and get some procurement dashboard examples and metrics and things like that, make sure you follow up with our presenters after today.
Okay, on the next page, the fourth item is don't try to transform everything. So this is kind of funny, right? You could say, well, Conrad, you sound a little bit scattered here. On a couple pages ago, you were saying make it comprehensive, and now you're saying don't do everything. Well, I'm just saying be realistic, right? You don't want to bite off. You're not going to eat the elephant in one meal. You're going to eat the elephant bite by bite over time. So the point is be very deliberate and very programmatic about what the biggest issues are and attack those first. And it's funny, I remember one project one procurement transformation I was involved in, we actually met with one of the business unit leads to talk about sourcing some of the larger, sort of more strategic spend categories and suppliers that they were involved with. And we almost got kicked out of their office because we walked in and we said, hey, we want to source this, this widget supplier, and the contract hasn't been sourced in 8 years, and we think the pricing has crept up, and the contract scope has expanded, and we really think it's ripe to be evaluated. And so we'd like some resources from your team, some engineers from your team or whoever to help us and staff this project. Seems like a no-brainer, right? So we walked in kind of thinking that was an easy discussion, and we were met with some really interesting resistance. That the business unit VP we were meeting with said, I have no interest in talking to you about this until you can get my PO's problem sorted out. The approval process and the cycle time in the purchasing group is not acceptable, and I'm not going to even engage with you on sort of more strategic issues until you can get the tactical issues resolved. So to the question, to whoever submitted that question a few minutes ago about, well, the executives really only want savings. I think that a lot of cases there are other issues that need to be sorted out, and sometimes those issues don't roll to the bottom line directly like savings does, but they do when it's things like cycle time and lead times and procurement management and things like that. So this was really interesting and actually sort of opened the door to say, great, we need to fix the procurement process. We're going to fix that first, and then we're going to come back to you and demonstrate that we're serious, and then we'll go ahead and launch the sourcing project. And so this was sort of a classic case of how these things need to be worked in parallel. It's kind of interesting that it was sort of the reverse situation that probably a lot of people are used to dealing with.
Well, what I like about this graphic, though, is that it does help get things in perspective, and because everyone's going to be saying where they think the biggest problems are, but once you line it up, it's very clear where your biggest performance gaps are, and they may not be the ones getting the most noise. So I love the idea that this would be your positioning as to why you're starting in certain areas and targeting gaps, in certain areas, and then not looking at things that other people might be complaining about. So this is a great graphic to show that. Now, to get the question was to get the capability top line, where does that information come from?
Well, this is sourcing interest group, so I have to be a little bit careful here, but I would say my memory's on the last page. That's exactly one of the values that when we do a procurement opportunity assessment, that's exactly what we do, is that we have a sort of a pretty good library of capabilities that we compare clients against, and so we can help them with this. But in lieu of that, in my non-commercial hat on here, in lieu of that, there are other sources and trade groups, and of course, Sourcing Interest Group is a great example of one, and of a place where folks can kind of understand what other people are doing on these various dimensions. And so, you can benchmarks and information sharing organizations like SIG can help with this as well. If a comprehensive sort of assessment approach isn't within your sort of roadmap plan, but oftentimes clients who know that they need to embark around procurement transformation, but they can't sell it to the executives or to the budget holders or to other folks in the organization, will want to engage with somebody like us to do an assessment and say, help me build the business case. And the reason I'm bringing this up again, Don, and I apologize if I'm too commercial, but you asked a few minutes ago about the business case, and we can talk about business case and what comes out of a business case, but every business case is completely different, right? There's every organization is different, and so the business case that comes out of it is going to be different, and you're not going to be able to produce a business case unless you understand this page and these fundamentals where you say what elements are we really lacking and which elements do we want to transform first.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That wasn't too commercial. I was keeping an eye on you.
All right, thanks. Okay, on to the next page. We talk about the fifth item, which is to not forget the soft side. And here we're talking about being collaborative. This is not procurement's not some new profit center that needs to start commanding attention and a new way of doing things and sort of ramming it down the throats of everybody in the organization. But it's really to say, how can we best modify our operation to serve the organization in the best way possible to generate as much value as possible? So we want to be collaborative and involve other folks around the organization. We want to involve as much of the organization as possible. And so we involve stakeholders in design and in procurement efforts, and we talk about how the implementation of changes is going to change how it's going to change their lives. One of the best things we've done here came out of another procurement transformation project where one of the senior VPs said, "This is terrific. I buy in and I support this, but until you can very clearly dictate how my life is going to change tomorrow and do that for my direct line managers, they're not going to be very interested in this." So you can say things sort of conceptually and academically on slides and in fancy presentations that talk about how we need to change and how we should change. But until it's in their backyard and they understand how it's going to make their life better, and you're very open and honest with them and they understand how their life is going to change maybe for the more inconvenient as well, until you're able to have that sort of open communication with them, this is not going to go anywhere off these slide pages. And so that's really where this collaboration and this stakeholder integration point comes in. And so we'll often typically recommend that you involve stakeholders, not just in the design, but in sort of the implications and the implementation as well. So that's, I think, the change management side that really needs to be carefully managed as you go through one of these procurement transformation projects. Now that's on the stakeholder side. There's also the internal procurement and strategic sourcing, organizational structure and issues around that, whether it's skills and kind of doing a skills assessment and figuring out who has the ability to think strategically, who has the ability to really manage the customer service aspects of the business, and who has the ability to negotiate well with suppliers, and then making sure that the right people have the right skills and the right people have the right opportunities to develop those right skills. That's the other piece that's going to really allow you to make this transformation stick in your organization. So it's not just, again, fancy slides, but it's how we're going to make this thing sustainable and implement it and make it sticky so that we actually change our behavior within procurement and sourcing. And then there's some other things here, around succession planning. I think there's some discussions recently around generation, the new generation workforce and younger workforce, and how do you sort of manage a higher amount of turnover than maybe we've been used to in the past, with younger workforce coming in and changing jobs every few years and that sort of thing. So there's some other things as well on the organizational side, but the key here is to be fundamentally collaborative with the rest of the organization, and then very focused on and critical of your own organization's skills and capabilities. So how do you do that? On the next page, we talk about building the infrastructure to create an effective team. And what we mean by that is really a kind of a center of excellence concept. And so how do you ensure that the core infrastructure and knowledge capture and all of these elements here in these 4 boxes are in place, but not managed completely centrally with one person, and they're shared throughout the organization and captured and utilized by everybody in the organization. And so basically, in order to do that, you structure it this way. You say, what's the process knowledge? And, that's my sourcing methodology, my tools and templates, maybe my market intelligence and spend analysis frameworks and things like that. Who owns that? Where does it last? Where does it exist? And then how is it updated? And that last one is oftentimes overlooked, right? So spend analysis. I mean, how many people? Okay, everybody's on the phone, but show of hands, how many people have a challenge with their spend cube being accurate in month after month after month? All right, it looks like almost everybody raised their hand. This is a systemic problem that almost all organizations struggle with at some level. So what's the process you have in place to formally update and make sure that your spend cube and your spend analysis is accurate or is, updated and corrected as time goes on? And that sort of process knowledge needs to be put in place and formalized. And then you can go from left to right across this page, and you can look at technology knowledge. Who has the latest e-sourcing training tool? Who has the latest? Or what happens when we do an update to the contract tool? How does that whole process work? On the previous page, I talked about organization and skills development. So from a training and knowledge management perspective, how does the sourcing curriculum roll through the organization? How do we ensure that people are staying current on certification? And what does that whole knowledge management system look like to make sure that there's a repository of knowledge so that when somebody leaves the organization, all of their knowledge doesn't go with them? And then, of course, something that's probably a little bit closer to home and more familiar to everybody on the call is the category knowledge. So, you could have somebody, your injected molded plastics expert, and they're the person that does all works with the business unit on all plastics issues, but then what happens when they leave? Well, you really need some sort of category management system, category playbooks, and other things that formalize the knowledge and that sort of repository of information so that information doesn't walk out the door. So it's just important to have that infrastructure behind the organization that so that you're not person dependent, but you're organization dependent. That if one person were to leave, for example, you're not in a hole and you're not in a bad spot. And so procurement transformation can give you that platform to develop an infrastructure, whereas typically, it's sort of everybody, a bunch of individuals doing the best job they can and doing a great job they can, and maybe consistent messaging and other things, but what's the power of the organization? The power of the procurement and sourcing organization is this infrastructure that's behind it that allows anybody in the organization to deliver a great value to the rest of the enterprise. And I think with that, Dawn, unless you have a question on this page or on the other.
I've got a number of questions. I thought I would hold some for when the poll's open.
Yeah, okay, so great, let's do that. We've got a polling question next, which basically asks, if you've been involved in transformation, which would you change if you could go back and do it all over again? So these are our five mistakes, right? So basically we're asking, another way to ask this question is, which was the biggest mistake, and which would you redo if you could do it again? So would it be more clearly articulating the vision up front? Would it be to be more holistic, not just do sourcing, but expand it out and solve some of these other challenges? Would it be C, focusing on more than just the savings? Would it be D, prioritizing the initiatives more effectively, or E, more focus on the soft side and the people element?
All right, so a couple things then. If we're going to talk about the vision, and there are a couple questions about stakeholder involvement, stakeholder engagement. So let me go to a quick question. It says, the best way to create a vision, is it to get it recommended from the executives and they come up with it, or is it using a facilitated session? And then my follow-on to that would be, from the other questions, is this something you involve your stakeholders to start getting their buy-in?
So I would say short answer is yes to all your questions. Longer answer, slightly longer answer, but I'll keep it brief, is, it totally depends on the organization. It depends on the maturity of the organization. It depends on what you want to accomplish. If everybody sort of is generally aligned and the executives have a kind of a clear perspective on what they want the organization to transform to, then maybe you don't need to spend a lot of time and effort coming up with something that everybody already understands. But if it's sort of a chaotic mess and everybody has maligned expectations, including stakeholders and folks within the organization, then sometimes there's nothing better than putting everybody in a room and having somebody come and say, okay, well, what do you want procurement to be in the future? So I would say it really depends on the situation, but the net result is you want to come out with a clear view, and it's a great opportunity to engage with stakeholders. Because if the stakeholder says, my fundamental problems are A, B, and C, and I want you to fix those, then there you go. Now you've got a platform, and you've got more than just you saying, I want to be better, and I want you to give me money to do a cool project that'll make my life easier. But now all of a sudden it flip-flops over to, oh, wait a minute. So you're saying, oh, I got it. You want to improve your organization so that you can deliver a better value to the enterprise. And that's a much more powerful message. So it's a great time to bring stakeholders in.
Okay, so why don't you address the poll, because I think it's very interesting that the split is so even, or rather evenly spread, I should say.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think what I would attribute this to is at the beginning of the conversation, if you recall, I said that we've seen clients do procurement transformation very differently, and procurement transformation means different things to different people. And one of the things that we really want to make sure that everybody gets out of today's discussion is that the purest sense of procurement transformation is a comprehensive approach. And so, different expectations and different sort of goals and objectives from procurement transformation can result in a completely even across the board split of answers from the audience. And I think it makes perfect sense that this would be split and folks would have different completely different experiences.
Okay. So then this is one that we have not addressed yet, and I think it's something that very interesting. And it says, how do you measure the capability or maturity with your internal business clients and their management? So your slides so far have talked about procurement and the supplier aspects, but they view it as a triangle. So that's a really good point. How do you get the maturity and capability of your internal clients to help you with this transformation and the direction?
That is. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to mention one thing we normally do when we do the ratings of where a procurement organization is along those dimensions is we always actually involve the stakeholders in giving those ratings. So some of those ratings are just hard quantitative benchmarks that the numbers speak for themselves, but then part of it is qualitative. And I think going out to your stakeholders, to your internal clients, to get their perspective of where you are in each of those dimensions, and there could be different dimensions that you need to measure as well. But I think that's a great way to involve stakeholders and get them to give their 2 cents of where they think you should be prioritizing your efforts as well.
Okay. Now you guys have one last slide. I want you to get to it, and then I want to make sure we push the slide deck so everyone has your contact information. So why don't we go to that next?
Okay. We got one more slide. I'm going to wrap this up with that, just to kind of summarize some of the things that Conrad went over, as well as just some other kind of final thoughts on transformation. So I think, as you heard from Conrad, transformation isn't a one-size-fits-all. There's not a cookie-cutter program. Certainly some lessons learned that you can use from others, but your specific program design will be based on things like, how mature your current organization is, the skill level of your current employees. Organizations that are starting from a very low skill base obviously are going to need to spend a lot more time and effort either training or hiring new employees, whereas others that have the right skill level, that's not a big deal. Company culture is another big part. To what extent can you engage your stakeholders? To what extent are they currently on board with you versus need to be really brought along? As some of the questions have indicated, a lot of companies are at different places with regard to culture and stakeholder involvement, which is really kind of the next one, to buy in from internal clients regarding progressive procurement practices. Also, your current level of automation and technology sophistication. The process boxes that Conrad talked about up top, when you're looking at transforming your process, if you've already implemented technology and you've already automated a lot of your processes, there may not need to be a lot of work there. But if you're starting from a very archaic standpoint, that might be a big focus of a transformation. And then just how you're currently doing sourcing, your spending level, your distribution of spend across spend categories. Are there just a handful of really big strategic categories, or do you have a lot of big spend categories? To what extent will the sourcing part of it, which may be used to fund the program, to what extent will that need to be complex or not? And then another thing we just talked about, obviously, was we think in order to design a procurement transformation program that's effective, you really need to step back and understand where you are currently, and that was the gist of some of the questions we were just talking about. We think that's spending a little bit of extra time up front with the design, understanding where you're at today, goes a long way to designing the right transformation program. Key stakeholders inside and outside of procurement. Again, Conrad's last slide. Should be involved, not only just as part of a collaborative effort, but they should be involved in the upfront assessment, as we just discussed. And lastly, just the planning phase. I've seen a lot of companies that just jump into procurement transformation. Day one, they want to start implementing transformation without really spending adequate time up front, building the fact base, getting information from stakeholders, understanding where they're at, building the business case. If it's going to be a self-funding program, building the business case that will show stakeholders that it's going to be self-funding. All that takes some time. Not a lot of time, but you really do need to spend at least, it could be 3 weeks or it could be 6 weeks. There is some startup phase to make sure that transformation goes right, and it's really important to invest the time to do that. And that's the conclusion of our presentation slides, and I assume we're out of time for questions here.
Well, we are, but you guys, we have some fabulous questions in queue, and so I do encourage you to follow up directly. You have the contact information for both John and Conrad right here, and of course, if you need phone numbers or anything like that, reach out to me. Now, what we have right now is the file transfer slide, so right now, folks, if you click on that, you can download the slides to your desktop. And Conrad and John, you generated more questions than I've seen in a long time. We probably have 15 questions in queue that we didn't get to. So I do apologize, folks, but you certainly keep it interactive and interesting and have some great ones that they can follow up with you later. But with that, the webinar will have to be ended to respect your time, and I appreciate John and Conrad for bringing us such a great topic, and I appreciate all of you guys for showing up for the webinar series. I hope to see you online next week. We've got another great one next week. So John and Conrad, have a wonderful day, and you'll have a lot of following up to do after today's webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. And by the way, Denali will be presenting at the summit. In fact, John and Conrad are presenting on a pre-con workshop on Tuesday. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation in person, they will both be there at the SIG Global Sourcing Summit in March. So make sure you look for them in the crowd, and if you want an introduction, let me know, and I'll be sure to find them for you. So folks, have a great day, and we'll see you next week in our webinar series. Bye-bye.